What's up? This is Bailey Cakes MTG doing another video, doing another PowerPoint. Today we're going in depth into different types of mana acceleration in Commander, discussing each type of mana acceleration, discussing the strengths of each type and the weaknesses of each type, some examples, and talking about when each type is used. In this picture, we have Mox, Mana Vault, Birds of Paradise, Ancient Tomb, different examples of different types of mana acceleration in the format. So why do we play mana acceleration? Well, you want to access threats more quickly than your opponents. You want to have more mana than your opponents to be able to play more spells. You want to deploy your commander more quickly, and you want to compete at higher power tables. This is why you want to play mana acceleration. I know in like bracket 4, bracket 5, most decks play a bunch of accelerants, and even in the lower brackets, you still play a lot of land ramp. So a lot of decks that play a lot of acceleration exist. And if you want to compete at the higher levels, you're going to have to play acceleration. One thing I will note is that a lot of people get stuck on the terminology. They say, well, ramp is different than fast mana, and that's different than mana dorks, and that's different than whatever. And I think it's kind of dumb to be stuck on these terms, because we're going to be talking about all of it. We're going to talk about ramp, we're going to talk about fast mana, we're going to talk about mana dorks, because each of them have their own place in the format. And each have their own strengths and weaknesses. So this is not a video just specifically on fast mana, or specifically on ramp, or specifically on mana dorks. It's about all of the acceleration in the format. The first type is probably the most expensive type and the most I don't know if it's the most powerful type. It's Moxen. They refer to 0 mana artifacts that tap to add mana, and Soul Ring I would consider in this category as well. So the Moxen that I want to talk about are Chrome Mox, Mox Opal, Mox Diamond. These are 3 very powerful cards. Chrome Mox, when it enters the battlefield, you may exile a non-artifact, non-land card from your hand, and you can tap it to add 1 mana of any of the exiled card's colors. So it does come with a downside of exiling a card from your hand, but it does ramp you. Mox Opal, you tap to add 1 mana of any color, but you can only do this if you control 3 or more artifacts. And then Mox Diamond is similar to Chrome Mox, but different in that with Mox Diamond you have to discard a land card, and it taps to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Some other examples of cards like this is Soul Ring, which is 1 mana to tap to add 2. You have Mox Amber, which taps to add a color if you have any legendary permanents in play. And yeah, those are the examples. So and of course the classic Moxes that are banned in the format. And the strengths are that you have immediate acceleration. You play it for 0 mana, and you immediately go from 1 mana to 3 mana on the next turn. It gives you color fixing, and they're very fast because you can play them as early as turn 1. The weaknesses are they are vulnerable to artifact hate, so things like Collector Oof, Stony Silence will turn them on. They're high financial investments, and cards like Chrome Mox and Mox Diamond, for instance, are card disadvantage, but they give you so much immediate mana acceleration that it's worth the card disadvantage. So these are strengths and weaknesses of this. I want to talk about mana rocks, and mana rocks have the same weaknesses as the Moxen, but less of the same strength. So mana rocks include cards like Arcane Signet, the Talisman and Signet cycles. These are played as mana acceleration that is slower than Moxen, but more attainable. And they have the same weaknesses as Moxen. They're weak to Collector Oof, weak to Artifact Disruption, but they are not as expensive. Like Arcane Signet's less than $1, for instance. And CEDH decks do play Arcane Signets and Felwar Stone and the talismans of their colors, in addition to Chrome Mox and Mox Diamond and Mox Opal. So these are definitely played. They do have the same weaknesses as Moxen in that they're weak to Collector Oof and weak to Artifact Destruction. I decided to talk about Mana Vault and Grim Monolith as a different type of thing than the Moxen and the Mana Rocks, because they give you a temporary burst of mana. So I called them Burst Mana Rocks. So they provide substantial bursts of mana but take investment to untap. So Mana Vault and Grim Monolith are your classic examples. Also Basalt Monolith too, but that's less of a powerful card in most circumstances. So Mana Vault, you tap to add 3, but it doesn't untap unless you pay 4 at the beginning of your untap step. Grim Monolith taps to add 3, but requires 4 to untap this. They provide a substantial burst of mana, right? Especially if you wait a turn to use them, but they take investment to untap. Well, why would you play these, right? Like Mana Vault is not as strong of a card as Mox Opal, but it provides you some explosive acceleration. And if you have something like a Kinnan, or you have something like a Forsaken Monument, you can actually combo off with a Mana Vault or with a Grim Monolith. Something that you can't do with just Mox. Weaknesses are they are susceptible to artifact hate, they're significant financial investment, and they don't fix mana the way that the Moxens do, and they require investment to untap. So what types of decks would you play these in? So thinking about Mana Vault and Grim Monolith, you would probably play these in decks where your commander is, 5, 6, 7 mana. For example, in Italy Primal Conqueror, you would play Mana Vault and Grim Monolith. While in decks where your commander is maybe 3 mana, like a Plagon deck, you're not going to really play Mana Vault. Or if you're playing Marwyn, why would you play Mana Vault, right? So in different circumstances, you would play these. In certain decks, you wouldn't play them. If you have like a Kinnan deck, you would also play these because they can give you more than the mana that's required to untap it, and you can tap, untap, tap, untap, tap, untap, make infinite mana. For instance, if you have Grim Monolith and Forsaken Monument, I think that goes infinite. Basalt Monolith with Kinnan goes infinite, so there's a lot of different combos if you're playing like a Kinnan deck or a deck with Kinnan in it. But yeah, these are very good for decks where your commander has a higher casting cost, or you're playing a lot of like colorless things. But in a lot of decks, you really don't need these. Is cost reducers. So these avoid the certain weaknesses of artifact mana in that they don't tap to make mana, so they can't be turned off by like a Collector Ooth or Stony Silence. And they're very efficient in spell slinger strategies, or if you're casting multiple spells per turn. So like compare Ruby Medallion to Arcane Signet, right? Ruby Medallion says red spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So it doesn't necessarily tap for mana, but let's say you play a Pyretic Ritual and a Desperate Ritual. That Pyretic Ritual costs 1 red, and that Desperate Ritual costs 1 red instead of 1 and a red for both of those. So, and Ruby Medallion will let you 2 mana if you cast 2 red spells, while Arcane Signet will only give you that 1 mana. So these are very good when you're casting a lot of cheap spells in a turn, like if you're casting a lot of rituals, but they don't tap for mana themselves, so they're not as strong and not as widely played as the Mana Rocks. But if you're playing like a Storm deck, definitely you're going to play things like Ruby Medallion in it. What are rituals? So what are rituals? Rituals are instants and sorceries that grant you a temporary burst of mana. So Dark Ritual Classic, 1 black gives you 3 black. Jessica's Will, 2 in a red, gives you red for each card in target opponent's hand. That could be 7 mana. That can be like 6 or 7 mana. And if you control your commander, you get that second ability. This card is busted. Some creatures do this too. So if you think of like Tinderwall or Reckless Barbarian, do this. Name Sticker Goblin is another creature that does this. But your classic example is Dark Ritual, and your most played one today is Jessica's Will. So the instants and sorceries that grant you a temporary burst of mana. The strengths of these: explosive mana generation, getting you from 1 black to 3 black, or 3 red to 6 red. Insane. They can be recurred from the graveyard of things like Underworld Breach. Because you use them, they go away. So if you have a graveyard recursion deck, or you have things like Underworld Breach or Snapcaster Mage, you can replay them from the graveyard. That's really sweet. They synergize with Magecraft and Prowess, and they're very good of cost reducers like Ruby Medallion. Because think about this: you're playing Jessica's Will, and you have a Ruby Medallion out. That Jessica's Will only cost 2, and you add that 6 mana, and whatever you use that mana on is now reduced as well. So that seems sweet. Weaknesses: they're one-time use. That can be mitigated if you recur them, but they are one-time use. They're countered easily on the stack, and what I mean by this is that there are more things that counter non-creature spells that are instants and sorceries, like Dispel, like Negate, like Dispel, Negate, Fierce Guardianship, Force of Negation. that don't get your creatures and people don't really use on mana rocks, but people will use them on rituals. Another strength is that they aren't susceptible to artifact hate like the mana rocks are. And another weakness is some have variable outcomes like the name sticker goblin, which requires you to high roll on stickers, and then Jessica's Will, which depends on how many cards in an opponent's hand. Jessica's Will can get you 6 or 7 mana, but if none of the other players are playing blue, or if they're playing, more aggro decks, or if everybody has low hands, Jessica's Will could maybe only add you 4 or 5. It's a variable outcome, which is one of the weaknesses of the card. If Mana Dork. Mana Dorks are creatures that tap to add mana. They are sneakily some of the best acceleration in the game and see heavy play in CEDH. If you look into any green CEDH deck, you're gonna see Birds of Paradise, Llanowar Elves, Elvish Mystic, Delighted Halfling in those decks because of how good these are as turn 1 plays. Birds of Paradise, classic example, 1 green mana, 0/1, tap, add 1 mana of any color. A great card. Deathrite Shaman, another great card. Exiles lands to give you mana and also has some other abilities. So these are examples of Mana Dorks. Other examples, Llanowar Elves, Finthorn Elves, Elvish Mystic, Delighted Halfling is one of the best ones because it can make a creature uncounterable. So let's talk about strengths and weaknesses of these. Strengths are that they're creature synergy. So if you have something like a Gaia's Cradle, the Mana Dorks work really well with. If you have something like an Eldritch Evolution or Neoform, these work really well with. They give you early game acceleration, so you can play these on turn 1 and ramp out onto turn 3, something, or turn 2, have 3 mana. They color fix you, Birds of Paradise, Deathrite Shaman, color fix you. You have additional utility, so Deathrite Shaman can drain your opponents or gain you life. It also has Kindred synergy if you're playing an elf deck and you play a lot of Mana Dorks that are elves. That can give you some valuable things like with card draw, like Leaf Crown, Visionary, or give you larger creatures that can actually win the game late in the game. If you have some like Crater of Behemoth or something, they can attack, which is relevant. If you're playing like Timna. The weaknesses are that they're vulnerable to removal. So things like Orcish Bowmasters, Path to Exile, Swords of Plowshares, people can spend to kill your Mana Dorks. Especially things like Pyroclasm are really potent against them. The vulnerable sweepers, Toxic Deluge is another widely played card that's good against them. A lot of in lower power formats, you see more sweepers. So like Wrath of God or Farewell, kill these. They're really bad late game draws. So if you top deck a Deathrite Shaman or Birds of Paradise late in the game, maybe not Deathrite Shaman. Deathrite Shaman is a fine top deck, but if you top deck, a Llanowar Elves on turn 6, that's not going to be very good. And they're susceptible to creature hate, removal, but also things like Curse Totem as well. So yeah, these are very fast ways of getting you mana, but they are very vulnerable to a lot of different things. And in the higher power level, I think Mana Dorks are better because there's less sweepers, but on the lower power level, there's more sweepers like Wrath of God and Farewell. So in those lower power level tables, Mana Dorks actually become worse. While in the higher power level tables, they're better because there's less sweepers. Although there are some sweepers at higher power tables like Toxic Deluge. I've seen some people play Kozilek's Return or Blasphemous Act as well. Best mana accelerant in the game, in my opinion, is Wild Growth. Like, Wild Growth may be the best piece of mana acceleration in the format. It's very resilient and has synergies of Enchantresses and Land Untappers, but Wild Growth on your land or Utopia Sprawl on your land is so good on turn 1, giving you that extra mana, ramping you from turn 1 or ramping you from 1 to 3, but also they're very hard to interact with. Things like Collector Oof don't shut them down. They can't be swept away by Toxic Deluge. And if you play like an Arbor Elf, you can untap your forest that has the Wild Growth on it. Or if you play Enchantress Commander, they'll draw you a card. So very good. Wild Growth, Utopia Sprawl, insanely good cards. We'll have 3 examples of these: Ancient Tomb, City of Traders, and Ugin's Labyrinth. So Ancient Tomb generates 2 colorless mana with no downside. You pay 2 life, which is a downside in formats like Legacy. but not much of a downside in Commander. Great card. It brings you to 1 to 3. If you're playing like a 2 or 3 color deck, you should always play Ancient Tomb. City of Traders and Ugin's Labyrinth have significant downside, but still are effective in their strategies. So City of Traders, whenever you play another land, it's sacrificed, which this is good as like the last land you play, and to give you like a little bit a burst of mana. So like a Tali would play City of Traders, and then Ugin's Labyrinth is really good in colorless decks or a lot of decks that have high convert mana cost artifacts or Eldrazi. Type number 8 is extra land drops. So these are cards like Exploration, which give you extra land drops. Let you play an extra land. So they require you to have extra lands in hand, which you don't always have those. They do have really high synergy of bounce lands because you can play the bounce land, bounce the other land you play, and then replay that. They work really well with landfall and land untappers. So like, landfall triggers and then, land untappers like Amulet of Vigor or Spelunking. And they're very difficult for your opponents to interact with. But the downside is they require you to have extra lands in hand. And you may not always want that, but if you're playing like a lands-based deck, these extra land drop cards are really good. Lastly, we will talk about Land Ramp. Land Ramp is spells that put lands from your library directly into play. So this one says, search your library for a forest card, put it on the battlefield, and shuffle us 3 visits. Probably the best one. So what are your strengths and weaknesses? Strengths. Lands are difficult and taboo to interact with. So if you play Nature's Lore and get a land into play, your opponent's not going to really interact with that land like they would like a Mana Rock or a Mana Dork. It thins your deck, which is sometimes relevant. It can trigger landfall, and it's good with land untappers like Spelunking or Amulet of Vigor. The weaknesses are they are very slow. The lands are tapped in a lot of different situations. With Nature's Lore and 3 visits, they don't, but like Rampant Growth and Farseek and all these other things they do, which is a significant downside. And they're slow. Most of them cost 2 mana. That's just too slow for higher power level tables. And there are instants and sorceries that are easily countered. But I don't think your opponent will counter them much. But that is a weakness to that. Talking about all these different ways of accelerating mana. The reality is most high-powered and CEDH decks play a combination of all the types of mana acceleration to mitigate the weaknesses of the individual type. A CEDH deck will play Moxen, Burst Rocks, Mana Dorks, Ancient Tomb, and Wild Growth, for instance, if they're in green. In a competitive meta, certain hate makes things like Moxen or Mana Dorks not always the best option. For instance, if you're playing Marwyn, do you need the Moxen? If you're playing Collector Oof effects, or if the meta is heavy on sweepers, should you trim dorks for Mana Rocks? These are questions you ask yourself. So yeah, that's a brief introduction to different types of mana acceleration in Commander. Casual versus CEDH. I kind of went over this a little bit. In casual decks, most acceleration is Mana Rocks and Land Ramp. In CEDH, mana acceleration is usually Moxen, Rocks, Rituals, Dorks, and Soul Lands. Also Wild Growth. Land Ramp is very rarely played. In slower formats, Mana Dorks and Moxen go down in usefulness, while Mana Rocks and Land Ramp go up in usefulness. The reason is that in slower formats, there's more sweepers, and getting that 0 extra 1 mana early in the game isn't that really potent as it is in more competitive formats where getting that extra mana is as potent. Mana Rocks giving you that long-term benefit, even though it's slower, is better. And Land Ramp giving you that benefit that's hard to interact with is more useful. Every green deck should play Wild Growth, though. That card is insanely good. So yeah, and honestly, a lot of decks don't play Wild Growth. It's like, why aren't you playing Wild Growth? It's literally like the best card. If you want a more detailed, and if you like reading, we have an article that I've listed about the different types of acceleration, and I have links to all the different cards. And I have, like, for example, Moxen, of strengths, weaknesses, and I go a lot into detail for them. Mana Rocks, strengths, weaknesses, burst Mana Rocks, strengths, weaknesses, cost reducers, strengths, weaknesses, rituals, strengths, weaknesses, and just examples of each one. Yeah, it's a more detailed article if you want to read it. It takes about like 15 minutes to read, or you can just thumb through the strengths and weaknesses. on this article. I put it in a link below. I think it was a good read.